How did you teach yourself to write well?
Well, that's good. I mean, a lot of aspiring writers out there, I wasn't aware of myself having been anything like a writer in, say, high school. I mean, I later looked back and was surprised to learn that I won the English prize, and the history prize. And I did have a tremendous foundation in English grammar. I went to a private school in Montreal in grade 7 where we had to memorize like the 120 sentence errors in English grammar. And literally we got whacked if we didn't know them. So, that may sound silly, but grammar is the architecture of writing. I mean, if you don't understand basic grammar, you can never be a writer. And I have just an incredible intuitive understanding of the grammar of the English language because of that experience when I was young. And what happened, and I always kept journals when I was on the road. And I certainly was deeply impressed, and I had mentors like the poet Gary Snyder. I never went anywhere without one of Gary's volumes of poems in my backpack. Peter Mathewson, a number of writers that I really admired. I was always drawn to the genre of travel books because that's sort of what I was doing, who I was. But what actually happened with the case of the Serpent and the Rainbow is, as I said earlier in the podcast, the zombie research was funded by Dr. Klein. They set up a dummy foundation called the International Psychiatric Research Foundation. And literally at the beginning, if I needed $5,000, $10,000 by Wednesday, I just had to call New York by Monday night. And I never knew who was the benefactor, but it turned out to be a wonderful man, David Merrick, the Broadway producer, who at that time had just had a huge success on Broadway with 42nd Street. And David had also done, obviously, a number of feature films, and he must have been hearing from Dr. Klein about my misadventures, and he saw a film from the very start in this. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, in an unbelievable 24 hours, Dr. Klein died during routine heart surgery, and Mr. Merrick had a debilitating stroke. So I literally went overnight from being flush with support to having none. And I did apply to all the standard research sources, various grants, foundations, but they all take months and months to let you know whether you're going to get the money or not. And I had guided that British journalist through the Darien Gap. His name was Sebastian Snow, and he had written a really kind of dreadful book about his journey called The Rucksack Man. And he actually lifted whole passages out of my diaries into his book, which actually was a fair exchange because it was the first time I saw my writing in print, albeit lifted from my journals. And I was able to give him something worth saying because I spoke Spanish and was hanging with the Indians all the time. He knew nothing about where he was. He said if he spoke the Queen's English loud enough, they'd understand. He was just this complete eccentric guy. He went mad, actually, on that in Costa Rica, but that's a whole nother story. But I thought, well, my God, if he could write a book, I can write a book. So that was an idea. He generously gave me the address of his literary agent in London. I walked off the street and said, I've got a couple of ideas. And this sort of Englishman looked down his nose, as they often do to Canadians, well, there might be something in that zombie thing. And before I knew it, I dictated the story into a typewriter, what happened to me, had it transcribed, typed by the late E.O. Wilson's secretary, and I had this big sort of 150-page thing, and I gave it in as a book proposal, got a contract for what then was an enormous amount of money for me, $35,000, spent it on some fun in Paris with a girlfriend, and then used the rest of it to finish the research. And then I had to actually write a book. And I wrote 2 chapters in Haiti. I had malaria and hepatitis at the same time, and I was really sick. And I wrote 2 chapters that I thought was the best thing since the Bible. And I sent it to the editor, and he sort of sent it back to me and said, try again. And so then I left the university, and a very dear friend of mine sort of plucked me out of Haiti and brought me to her beautiful farm in Virginia to both get well but also to write the book. And I stayed there working in a slave cabin for 7 months. And I had a great story to tell. I had lived this story. I just had to find the way to tell it. So what I did, and no one gave me this idea, and I certainly had never taken a creative writing course. I mean, most creative writing courses are taught by people who are teaching creative writing courses because they can't write creatively. And otherwise, they'd be not doing that. They'd be writing books. But that may be a little harsh. But all of us, lots of times, have to get academic jobs. Don't get me wrong. But what I did is I just took all my favorite books, Hemingway, for example, for dialogue, No One's Better, Isaac Dinesen for landscape, Lawrence Durrell in the Alexandria Quartet. How do you evoke the exoticism of a place as surreal as Haiti? Well, how about Alexandria in the 1940s? Carpentier for mystical thing. And this pile by my typewriter, kept changing and so on, but it was always there. And I never obviously copied or plagiarized, but as I was trying to tell my story and I was stuck on how to do it, like what language to use, I would just pick up any book randomly and read for a while. And it was just weird, almost like by osmosis. I was often writing at night. I had lots of coca and I was kind of in this kind of creative space. And again, one thing that I think a lesson of all that is, in the end, I wrote that book in 7 months and it was edited in a single day. And it came out and it sold 500,000 copies.
Hold on. You say edited in a single day?
Oh, yeah. Almost no editing whatsoever.
No. Oh, okay. I see. All right. Got it.
What I mean by that is there's lots of different ways of writing. Some people like to sort of spit out a first draft, as they say, or, just puke it onto the page. Well, I've just never understood how you could make something beautiful of puke. So I, to my detriment, perhaps, I'm a much more laborious writer. And I've never done a second draft of a book. I do that in a way as I'm going through, as I write a paragraph, I'm paying attention. I think writing is analogous to sculpture. You got to pay attention. Like Barbara Tuchman, the great historian, had a little note above her typewriter, will they turn the page, And you have to create rhythms in every line. You have to end every paragraph with something that's going to make the reader want, and it becomes unconscious, right? But at the same time, you're paying attention to the cadence of every word, at least I am. And that's when you talk about lyricism. And that was a skill I had to learn. In the early days, it was very funny. My wife wouldn't bother to edit or look at anything I write anymore. We've been married too long. But in the early days, she was wonderful at not editing per se. She never added any words or deleted anything, but she had a little stamp that we called the puke meter. And if I had a passage where I went beyond lyricism to purple prose, she'd just stamp it, like little face of someone throwing up. And that was really kind of wonderful because she was a great reader. And you learned you can always go out on the lyrical edge, if you will, because you can always pull it back, but you can't bring spirit to dry prose, And it's interesting. I mean, like everything else, you get better and better the more you do it. Now I write bizarrely effortlessly. I mean, no one writes effortlessly. Hemingway said anyone who says they write easily is either a bad writer or a liar. Also, I've never mistook activity for results because I've been self-employed most of my life, and I've never indulged writer's block. Can you imagine if a plumber came to your home, looked at you, and suddenly patted their brow and said, just can't do it today, I've got plumber's block? You'd call the bloody police, right? No, writing's a craft. You get up in the morning and you do it. But one of the things that really was amazing to me, a real turning point in my life, having been raised in that kind of simple middle-class world where creativity happens to someone else. The Beatles are creative. Leonard Bernstein is creative, whatever. When I finally understood that creativity is not the motivation of action, it's a consequence of action. If you don't do, you can't create. So, that insight, and acting on that insight changed my life. I never sat around to wait for permission to write about any subject. People will say, oh, I can't write about World War I because I'm a botanist. No, you apply the same research skills that you use to write about the Haitian zombie to understanding the essence of British culture in Edwardian England, And in the same token, you can't be a photographer if you don't take pictures. The way you become a better photographer is to take more and more images and to study the work of the masters. That's what I always would say to a young person. If you want to write nonfiction, find the nonfiction that you think is the best going and pay attention. Don't just read it, study it. It's the same thing with music. Listen to any of these great characters, from Jimmy Page to the beloved and late Jeff Beck. Just terrible he passed away. They always talk about how they mined the work of every other blues player before them, practice, practice, practice. I mean, Jerry Garcia never had a guitar out of his hands, nor did Hendrix, So you just have to do it. It's that classic idea of, do what needs to be done and only then ask whether it was permissible or possible. One of the things that I've found, Tim, about life is that at every single stage of life, there's someone telling you shouldn't do something. And nobody wants you to change. In my case, it was like, you're from Canada. What's wrong with the university? Why do you have to go to Harvard? Wait a minute. You're supposed to be a lawyer. What's this anthropology thing? Wait a minute. You're an what's this botany thing? We just came back from the Amazon. What's this voodoo thing? Wait a minute. How can you go work in a logging camp? Your father just spent half his money sending you to this fancy school. Wait a minute. You've been in a logging camp. Why should you be a park ranger? Wait a minute. It's always like that. And you just can't look behind you. I remember our mutual friend, Mark Plotkin, once told me, in the early days, the problem with climbing up the flagpole is that there's always somebody looking up your butt.